Hi everyone. I want to start by thanking Daniel and the rest of the organizing team for putting together this workshop, and thanks to all of you for being here. Today I'm going to talk about the role of global economic networks in British informal imperialism in Ottoman Iraq. And I'm actually, despite the topic of the conference, going to be going back into the 19th century a little bit. Specifically, I'm going to look at two enterprises, the Lynch Brothers Steamship Company on the Tigris, and the consortium which built the Hindia Barrage on the Euphrates, as expressions of two different forms of economic imperialism. I'll explore the global trading and capital networks that were standing behind each project. British informal imperialism in Iraq, though, was not only shaped by these established trading and capital networks. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was invested in its own efforts to incorporate Iraq and the rest of the Gulf region more securely back into the imperial fold, which made them particularly suspicious of British activity in southern Iraq and shaped the possibilities for economic intervention in the region. The diplomatic controversies which emerged over each project centered on the relationships between political and economic power. Those relationships and the changing goals for them espoused, particularly by the British side, will be the focus of this paper. And I'll also argue that the two projects representing these two different kinds of global economic network were essentially unable to coexist fruitfully because of the tense nature of Anglo-Ottoman relations and the defensive Ottoman stance towards its Gulf periphery. So I'll start with the Lynch brothers and the Euphrates and Tigris Steam Navigation Company, or actually a little bit earlier with Francis Rawdon Chesney and his 1836 steamship mission down the Euphrates. Chesney's mission to open up a quote-unquote Euphrates route to India was a failure in terms of Indian defense, but had some important commercial results. After Chesney left Iraq, Henry Bloss Lynch was appointed to command his remaining steamship and Indian diplomatic relations in what they called Turkish Arabia. At Lynch's urging, his younger brothers Stephen and Thomas came to Baghdad and founded an import-export business, one of a group of new merchant enterprises encouraged by Chesney's report of favorable trade conditions. The Lynches then started running their first steamship on the Tigris in 1861. To do that, they in many ways had to distance themselves from the community of expatriate merchants in which they previously participated in order to claim the legacy of the Chesney mission for themselves solely. They built their claim to be able to run steamships on the Tigris on a particular interpretation of the Fadrons granted to Chesney in 1836 and the follow-up letters given to his successor, their brother Lynch, in 1841 and 1846. And I can go into that later if you're interested. Because the Lynch brothers faced a lot of trouble attracting business, particularly as they started out, they essentially had to create the trade that their ships would carry, and they did that by linking themselves into a larger developing network of merchants and merchant shipping in the Indian Ocean. The Lynch brothers developed a symbiotic relationship with the import firm Gray Mackenzie, which was based in Basra, and as of 1870 held the contract to import coal for the Lynch ships. So they had a sort of symbiotic relationship. Gray Mackenzie was also affiliated with Gray Paul in Bushehr in Iran, and with Gray Dawes, which ran steamships in the Gulf. Gray Dawes was also dependent on the Lynch steamships, as their own ships had to stop in Basra every week, as they operated the Indian mail contract on behalf of the larger British India steam navigation line. Both Gray Dawes and Gray Paul had also acted as agents for the British India line since the 1860s, and British India was more than just a merchant shipping line. In addition to being one of the most powerful agents of British-led globalization and economic imperialism, it also functioned as a merchant marine and auxiliary to the Indian Navy in times of war. So the Lynch brothers were part of one of the most important experiments in British informal imperialism in this period. In general, the maintenance of small merchant communities around the world through the award of shipping and mail contracts was seen as a cheap and easy way to maintain British influence, and this was the fundamental assumption underlying imperial support for the Lynch Company, although it can be debated whether or not that was actually the case in Iraq. The postal contract that bound the Lynch brothers into this broader network of merchant shipping and British influence also serves as a window onto political and economic power and British-Ottoman relations. The Lynch brothers were very reliant on the postal subsidy, both financially and as a confirmation of their legitimacy, not just to operate, but to operate as an arm of the British Empire. Whenever they got into their not infrequent disputes with the Ottoman state, the company called on both Delhi and London for help, usually invoking the postal contract. In 1883, for example, the company argued in its appeal that both the trade they fostered and the mails they carried were, quote, vital interests to be protected by the British state. Both the Lynches and British diplomats in Iraq consistently referred to the Lynch ships as mail steamers, pushing the limits of Ottoman tolerance on the assumption that the state wouldn't interfere with the official business of these ships. But in some ways, the Lynches dug their own grave. Their repeated invocations of the mail subsidy as evidence of their vital service to the British Empire provoked greater scrutiny of the actual nature of that service. Starting at the beginning of the 20th century, the Lynches faced numerous complaints about their schedule, basically that the ships were often late and missed the mail connection. The company offered up a variety of excuses: low water, Arab attacks, fog, but British consular officials were inclined to think that the company simply prioritized its commercial business over its government cargo, taking too much cargo, for example, which brought in more money but slowed the ships down considerably. Consul Newmarch, writing in 1905, argued that their profit-seeking behavior was not a problem in itself, but became a problem in the context of the Lynch's repeated calls for strong government support, both diplomatic and monetary. When the mail contract actually came up for renewal in 1914, the Lynch Company was bold enough to request an increase in the mail subsidy, arguing that the barges they now towed were increasing their running expenses. The discussion was postponed by the outbreak of World War I, but the contours of the discussion about the appropriate relationship between government and commerce in the extension of British influence in Asia suggest that this kind of arrangement was more than just a cheap and easy method of avoiding military intervention. The Lynch brothers clearly occupied a position of relative power in their negotiation with the British state, partly due to their success in appropriating the mantle of the Chesney expedition. Other actors, including the Ottoman government, often referred to the Lynch brothers and the British state in Iraq as if they were identical. Though the British diplomats tended to be somewhat annoyed by this tendency, it's clear that they also saw the Lynch brothers as performing a valuable service. As late as 1908, after many of the problems with the Lynch business had come to light, George Lloyd and the Board of Trade were still advocating for similar arrangements to be made elsewhere around the Gulf in order to preserve British influence from the increasing threat of German trade. This perception often led the government to cave to Lynch's demands. In 1912, for example, the consulate supported Lynch's campaign to be allowed a third steamship against their better judgment. The government was worried about provoking the Ottomans, but Lynch argued that a third ship would allow them to travel faster with the same amount of cargo and thus deliver the mails on time. They did get the third ship, but they did not start delivering the mails on time. It's important, I think, to note the shifts over time in the ways the Lynches justified their project to the government. Well, in the 1880s, they argued that both their commercial and postal activities were vital to British government influence. By the early 20th century, the government had come to see those two functions as contradictory. So we see a shift after that to a more strictly legalistic focus on the postal contract itself and on the legal basis for the Lynch presence in Iraq. This may be partly because of the shift to a different kind of economics as the basis for government intervention, which I'll address later in talking about the barrage. But throughout, the Lynches relied on the postal subsidy as a marker of their position internal to the British Empire. But British postal service was not just an intra-imperial issue. It created problems over the years with the Ottoman government, basically as it was seen to usurp Ottoman sovereignty. The local government made several attempts to stop or at least control the mail service, threatening repeatedly to force all mails to be carried on Ottoman ships, and extracting an 1882 concession from the Indian government that parcel mail could be treated like cargo and searched. In a seeming contradiction, the Ottomans also sometimes argued that the Lynch ships ought to be forced to carry the Ottoman mails for free. But I think what all these policies have in common are attempts to assert sovereignty, whether over the mails, which was a component of the modernization projects of the Tanzimat and Hamidian states, or over foreign companies like Lynch. The issue of the postal subsidy for the Ottomans was often raised in the context of the dubiousness of the Lynch permissions to be operating on the Tigris at all, which came up every time the Lynch brothers requested an extension to their service, like the third steamship I mentioned earlier. The local government was very resistant to these extensions to the Fadman, even though they insisted that the Fadman did not even apply to Lynch in the first place. Generally, they granted extensions to the service only for emergencies, like the towing of barges to carry grain during a famine, which were then never revoked. Essentially, the Lynch brothers were able to leverage gaps and inconsistencies in both the British and Ottoman positions to advance their own commercial ambitions. They were much bolder about deploying British imperial might than the state itself was, knowing that the state basically felt that, at least in Iraq, felt that it couldn't do without them and would support them. The Ottomans, on the other hand, were never able to muster the diplomatic might to get rid of the Lynches entirely, and it's not actually clear that that would have been desirable, given the ease with which the state could at least tax cargo traffic carried on steamers. I'm going to turn now to talking about the Hindia Barrage and the nexus of investment capital which stood behind it. I won't go into detail about the reasons the barrage was being built, though I can later if you're interested, but essentially it was fulfilling important local governing priorities for the Ottoman government and found enthusiastic supporters among a cohort of British Indian irrigation engineers who saw Iraq as a biblical landscape ripe for scientific regeneration on the mold of Egypt or the Punjab. The Ottoman government built a series of temporary dams on the Euphrates over the course of the late 19th century, but the barrage project was really started after the Committee of Union and Progress came to power in 1908, and committed itself to modernization projects, including the Hindia Barrage and the broader scientific irrigation of Iraq. Significantly, the CUP was much more favorable than previous governments to the introduction of British investment capital in the empire, a development the British seized on in an attempt to regain lost ground against the Germans, who had the Baghdad Railway contract, and the French, who dominated the funding structures at the Ottoman Bank. The Ottomans first hired William Wilcox, an irrigation engineer who'd been a tireless promoter of regenerating Iraq and who'd come up with a comprehensive irrigation plan for the region. But his employment fell apart after just a few years, and construction on the barrage was turned over to a consortium consisting of the National Bank of Turkey, a British investment house based in Istanbul, and the Sir John Jackson Company, an international contracting and construction engineering firm. This consortium, which collaborated on a number of infrastructure projects across the Ottoman Empire, was emblematic, I think, of a different kind of international network and a different kind of economic influence than that which the Lynch brothers were part of. The National Bank was another product of the post-1908 Anglo-Ottoman thaw. It was founded at the request of the Ottoman government, but also with explicit backing from the British state, which hoped that it could compete with the Ottoman Bank. The bank was seen by British diplomats as crucial not only in supporting British interests within the Ottoman state, but also in providing the financial assistance which could potentially prevent a breakup of the empire. I mean, that may have been a sort of wild imagination on their part, but that's what they thought. The Jackson Company, which was partnered with the bank on the barrage project, was involved in construction projects all over the world, from the base of Tower Bridge in London to the Arica-La Paz Railway in South America to the new harbor in Singapore. They were not the only firm doing this kind of work, and in fact there were another number of other British and German consortia competing for the Hindia contract. This consortium, I think, was representative of a new vision for the relationship between economic and political power. Instead of trade, the idea behind the National Bank and British support for companies like Jackson was capital investment and the transformation of physical infrastructure as the basis for political influence. This was actually an attitude shared by the Ottomans, who looked to infrastructure, particularly in peripheral regions like Iraq and the Hijaz, as a means to stake claims to sovereignty and to reincorporate marginalized regions back into the imperial mainstream. For the British, investing in the Hindia Barrage was never completely divorced from trade, as it was imagined that irrigation would increase export possibilities and create new room for imports by enriching the country overall, but this was really a secondary concern. Primarily, they were interested in entrenching British investment by making themselves indispensable to subsequent projects. This forward-looking attitude was central to the disagreements over funding, which were the crux of the Ottoman-British conflict over the barrage. There were two primary British factions with different views on how to fund construction on the barrage, and, relatedly, what the endpoint of British involvement in Iraq should be. The first faction argued that the Ottomans should not be allowed to take out any loans in order to fund hydraulic projects, as they would then lose control over those projects, which should really be used to prop up provincial and imperial revenues through agricultural increase. The second faction, led largely by Lorimer in the Baghdad consulate, argued that British aims would be best served by having the Ottomans meet funding gaps on the barrage by providing surplus revenues directly from the Indian government, using debt to guarantee permanent British involvement in the region. Both factions agreed that the British should continue to be involved in hydraulic and social engineering in Iraq, with even those against Ottoman debt essentially arguing that British advisors should be retained permanently or semi-permanently to help with post-construction projects like canal management and the adjustment of land tenures, despite a lack of evidence that the local government in Baghdad was interested in those projects. While the second faction never outright argued that debt should be used as an excuse to take over Iraq politically, that was the obvious conclusion based on previous experience, particularly in Egypt. It was a fear openly shared by the Arab elite in Iraq, who assumed that British investment was basically just a prelude to invasion. What both groups of British diplomats shared with local observers was a focus on colonization and the other social engineering schemes they assumed would follow the barrage. Though the diplomats were not interested in the kind of scientific comprehensiveness advocated by Wilcox and other irrigation engineers, they saw the barrage as part of a socially comprehensive whole, so it was seen as unacceptable that irrigation and agricultural arrangements would continue as before. The assumption that social engineering had to go with hydraulic engineering was a way to dismiss the more immediate Ottoman political aims in constructing the dam, and also to envision a perpetual British expert and financial presence in the region. The Ottomans, though, were able to divert Jackson and the British by proposing other hydraulic projects which would continue employing British engineers without entering immediately into the question of social engineering. In practice, funding the barrage was a much messier process. Theoretically, the bank was supposed to advance money to Jackson to cover their expenses, and the Ottoman government was supposed to reimburse them on a rolling basis. In December 1912, the system hit a roadblock because of Ottoman budget shortfalls. Jackson threatened to cease construction if he was not reimbursed. The bank paid up, but demanded an almost immediate turnaround from the Ottomans, to which the central government agreed, but the Valley of Baghdad refused, and there followed about a month of negotiations over payments and then partial payments before the matter was resolved. The crisis had the effect of exposing how false the apparently united fronts, both on the British and Ottoman sides, were. On the British side, Jackson and the bank were constantly sniping over whose responsibility it was to provide funding, and using this kind of brinksmanship tactics, like threatening to stop work or stop capital flows, and in fact the National Bank threatened to shut down operations entirely during this period. On the Ottoman side, the crisis revealed a disjunct between central government and provincial priorities. Without having looked at the Ottoman records on this issue, it's difficult to pinpoint the cause of this divide, but I think it's clear that there was one, and it's potentially important in thinking about the dynamics of imperial modernization and centralization in this period. This particular funding crisis was also the event which prompted Lorimer's suggestion that the government of India try to loan the Ottomans the funds to finish construction. It appears that the Ottomans began reimbursing the bank quickly as soon as they learned of these British intentions, suggesting that the state shared many of the same anxieties as the local elite. Though the Ottomans were in fact more than complicit in bringing British capital to Iraq, the practical difficulties associated with funding projects like these highlighted the tensions inherent in this new Anglo-Ottoman friendship. Ottoman desires to attract British finance capital and modernize infrastructure were always moderated by wariness about British intentions. In closing, I'd like to just briefly draw out some of the dynamics created by the competition between these two forms of informal imperialism in Iraq, and to think about how their differences might point to shifts both in the relationship between economic and political power and in the Anglo-Ottoman relationship on the eve of World War I. Ottoman observers were not actually inclined to differentiate between different kinds of British interference in Iraq, and we see Ismail Haqqi, the Baghdad representative to the Ottoman parliament, in 1908 bemoaning the, quote, clause of English influence in general. But actually I think the dynamic created by the existence of different imperial projects limited the extent to which those clauses could really sink into Iraq. In September 1911, a controversy developed because Jackson had awarded the Lynch brothers a contract to transport construction material to the barrage site. The Valley of Baghdad insisted that they cancel the contract if the British wanted to maintain positive relations with the Ottoman Empire. And surprisingly, the British ambassador in Istanbul agreed. Both the ambassador and the Foreign Office took the opportunity to launch vicious attacks on the Lynch Company, attacking them personally, as well as accusing them of holding back the development of Iraq instead of supporting it like irrigation presumably would. They accepted at face value Wilcox's prediction that irrigation would render navigation on the Tigris and Euphrates impossible, taking that as an excuse to at least rhetorically abandon the Lynch brothers and trash navigation and trade as sources of political power. The grand possibilities suggested by the nascent irrigation project on the Euphrates forced the British to confront the failures of trade as a basis for imperial political power in Iraq, and also clarified the ways the Lynches had been able to exploit their political position to their own economic advantage, basically making the empire beholden to a single company. The rapid British abandonment of the Lynch brothers also points to shifts in the political role of economic interests. While the Lynches had always felt the need to assert and reassert their own position within the empire, despite the direct financial support of the postal subsidy, the Jackson Company was always more secure in its imperial positions. This seems to potentially indicate the greater political significance of investment, but also the ways in which a more anxious British Empire in this late phase felt it had to cling to these kind of informal imperial tools. I think the legitimacy claims also point to shifts in the Anglo-Ottoman relationship. However they subverted those structures, the Lynch brothers were claiming legitimacy through an Ottoman framework, the Farman. Jackson's work, on the other hand, relied on international open tenders, which in fact were never concluded, and they basically just operated solely on temporary contracts. This might indicate a weaker Ottoman position in the international arena, but I think it also points to changing frameworks of legitimacy within the Ottoman state. The competition between the two forms of informal empire in Iraq also provided opportunities for the Ottomans to advance their own interests. It's clear that while both Lynch and Jackson satisfied some Ottoman governing priorities, the empire was far more committed to the success of the irrigation project, and they were able to leverage the divided British position to put pressure on the Lynch brothers, advancing some of their own governing goals. Overall, I think the experience of Iraq is important in helping us understand how British economic imperialism was actually implemented and what imperialism even means when we're talking about this variety of different interests and goals. Looking at the issue as well within the context of the Ottoman Empire provides a context in which imperialism was mixed up with interstate relations. British imperialism wasn't something that could simply be imposed on a place like Iraq, where there was another imperial governing power with its own priorities. At the same time, this kind of relationship on the periphery helped clarify interstate relations. By 1913, most British capital in the Ottoman Empire was in Iraq, and British diplomats referred to Iraq as, quote, one of the most vital parts of our sphere of influence. Though I would hesitate to draw a direct line between these informal imperial projects and the 1914 invasion of Iraq, it seems reasonable to say that the history of British involvement in Iraq made it an obvious place for an invasion, and we can see the legacy of these projects continuing in British governments in Iraq after the invasion. I'll stop there. Thanks.